The wind had a voice that night and it spoke of endings. It was a low keening sound, the kind that doesn't just pass through you but settles in deep in the marrow where your body keeps its oldest fears. It scraped against the rough-hewn timbers of the lean-to, a shelter that was more prayer than structure, more stubbornness than wood. Inside, the cold was not merely an absence of warmth, it was a presence. It had weight, it pressed against Lorena's chest like a stone hand, slowing her blood, thickening her thoughts, turning each breath into a small white surrender. She watched the last ember in their fire pit shudder, glow a desperate orange, and die. Just like that. No fight, no flicker, just gone. Beside her, her mother Colette was a still silent shape wrapped in every blanket and scrap of cloth they owned. 72 years had carved deep lines into her face, but the cold was smoothing them now, as if rehearsing the stillness to come. Only the faintest tremor in her hand, which clutched Lorena's, betrayed the life still flickering within. At their feet, Beckett, their German shepherd, refused to settle. He paced the 3 steps. The shelter allowed a low growl vibrating in his chest, not aimed at any visible threat, aimed at something worse. He could smell what was coming, and what was coming was the end of everything. Do you know that feeling? That moment when hope is no longer a flame, but a single fading spark. You shield with hollowed hands, Lorena knew. The wind had a voice that night, and it spoke of endings. It was a low keening sound, the kind that doesn't just pass through you, but settles in deep in the marrow where your body keeps its oldest fears. It scraped against the rough-hewn timbers of the lean-to, a shelter that was more prayer than structure, more stubbornness than wood. Inside, the cold was not merely an absence of warmth, it was a presence. It had weight. It pressed against Lorena's chest like a stone, hands slowing her blood, thickening her thoughts, turning each breath into a small white surrender. She watched the last ember in their fire pit shudder, glow a desperate orange, and die. Just like that. No fight, no flicker, just gone. Beside her, her mother Colette was a still silent shape wrapped in every blanket and scrap of cloth they owned. 72 years had carved deep lines into that face, but the cold was smoothing them now, as if rehearsing the stillness to come. Only the faintest tremor in her hand, which clutched Lorena's, betrayed the life still flickering within. At their feet, Beckett, their German shepherd, refused to settle. He paced the 3 steps the shelter allowed, a low growl vibrating in his chest, not aimed at any visible threat, aimed at something worse. He could smell what was coming, and what was coming was the end of everything. Do you know that feeling? That moment when hope is no longer a flame, but a single fading spark you shield with hollowed hands. That moment when the world has taken so much from you that the only thing left to lose is the act of breathing itself. Lorena knew. She was 24 years old and she felt like 100. Her stomach was a hollow pit, her toes had gone numb hours ago, and somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the cold and the grief that had become her constant shadow, a small stubborn voice whispered that this mountain had already decided their fate. It had taken her husband, now it had come for the rest. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because every ending has a beginning, and this one started not with ice and wind, but with sunshine and sawdust, with a man's laughter echoing of freshly cut timber, with love built log by log into the walls of a small cabin in a Colorado valley. Let me take you back. 6 months before this frozen night, the world was a different place. The valley below the Sangre de Cristo range was a quilt of gold and green, the aspens turning their leaves to fire, the creek running cold and clear over smooth stones. And in that valley, set against a backdrop of mountains so vast they made you feel both insignificant and infinite, stood a cabin. It was not much to look at. A single room downstairs, a sleeping loft above a stone chimney that smoked when the wind blew from the north. The porch tilted slightly to the left, a fact that Silas Calloway had promised to fix every Sunday for 2 years running. He never did fix it. But he built everything else. Every log was cut by his hands, every joint fitted with a precision that bordered on devotion. He was a man who believed that the things you build with your own hands carried a message in them, that a home was not just shelter but a declaration of intent. A promise made in wood and stone that said, I am here, I will stay, I will hold. Lorena had fallen in love with him the way you fall asleep on a long journey, slowly, then all at once, and by the time you realize it has happened, you cannot remember what the world felt like before. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with hands rough as bark and eyes the color of creek water in autumn. His laughter was the kind that started deep in his belly and worked its way out like a force of nature, filling whatever room he was in, making it feel warmer, safer, more alive. They had married in the spring of 1871 in a small ceremony by the creek with wild flowers in Lorena's hair and Colette weeping quietly in a chair someone had carried down from the cabin. There was no preacher. Old Holt, their nearest neighbor, 3 miles down the valley, read something from a leather-bound Bible he claimed had survived both a flood and a bar fight, and Silas had slipped a ring made of hammered copper onto Lorena's finger and said simply, I will build you a life. And he did. For 2 years, that cabin in the valley was the entire world, and it was enough. They worked the small plot of land Silas had claimed, coaxing vegetables from the rocky soil, running a few head of cattle on the high meadows in summer. It was a hard life, a life measured in blisters and early mornings, and the constant grinding negotiation with a landscape that gave nothing for free, but it was theirs. Colette had come to live with them after Lorena's father died, a quiet man who had slipped away one winter night as gently as he had lived. She was a woman of sharp wit and sharper tongue, her body bent by time, but her mind bright as polished silver. She kept the cabin's accounts, mended their clothes with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, and read aloud to them in the evenings from a small collection of books she guarded like treasure. Beckett had been a pup when Silas brought him home, a squirming bundle of fur and oversized paws that tripped over its own ears. Silas had found him abandoned by a creek, half-starved and shivering, and had tucked him inside his coat for the ride home. The dog had grown into a magnificent animal, 80 pounds of muscle and instinct, with a coat like dark copper and eyes the color of aged whiskey. He was devoted to all of them, but there was a particular bond between him and Lorena, a wordless understanding that went beyond the simple loyalty of a pet. He watched her with an intelligence that sometimes felt unsettling, as if he understood not just her words, but her silences, her fears, the things she could not say. The trouble began with the harvest of 1873. It was a bad year. The rains came too late, then too hard, then not at all. The creek that fed their small irrigation ditch dropped to a trickle, and the vegetables that had been their mainstay withered in the fields. The cattle grew thin on the overgrazed high meadows. By late summer, it was clear that they would not have enough to see them through the winter. Silas did not tell Lorena about the loan. This is important to understand because it explains everything that followed. He was not a secretive man by nature. He was open and generous, the kind of person who would give you the shirt off his back and then apologize that it wasn't cleaner. But he carried within him a deep, almost primal need to provide, to protect, to ensure that the people he loved never felt the sharp edge of want. It was his greatest strength, and as it turned out, his fatal flaw. He rode into town one August morning telling Lorena he was going to price feed for the cattle. Instead, he went to the office of Declan Whitmore. Whitmore was a man you need to understand because men like him are the gears that grind the world. He was not tall, not imposing, not the kind of villain you would recognize in a crowd. He was middling in every physical respect, a man of medium height, medium build, a face that was neither handsome nor ugly, but simply present like a ledger waiting to be filled. His eyes were his only remarkable feature, a pale washed-out blue that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, The eyes of a man who looked at a forest and saw bored feet, who looked at a river and saw water rights, who looked at a family and saw a line item. He had come west from Philadelphia 3 years prior, not out of any frontier spirit, but because his investments in the East had gone bad. He was a man running from creditors into a place where creditors had not yet arrived, and he had set himself up in the small town of Ridgewater as a man of means, a lender, a dealer in property and futures. He was not cruel in the way a wolf is cruel. He was cruel in the way a machine is cruel. He simply did not see people. He saw numbers, assets, liabilities. Silas borrowed $400 against the deed to their land. It was a staggering sum, enough to buy seed and feed and supplies to see them through the winter and into the next planting season. The terms were clear: repayment by the following summer with the land as collateral. Silas signed the paper with a hand that did not shake because he believed with the unshakable faith of a man who had built a home with his own hands that the next year would be better, that the rains would come, that the land would provide. He hid the loan papers beneath a loose floorboard in the cabin along with something else, a leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with his careful, cramped handwriting, maps, sketches, measurements. For months in the quiet hours when Lorena thought he was checking the cattle on the high ridges, Silas had been exploring the mountain. He had followed the creek to its source, climbed into the high cirques where the snow never fully melted, poked into crevices and canyons that no one had reason to visit. On the last page, in handwriting that trembled slightly, he had written 7 words: "I have seen it, but I need more time." He never got that time. The fever came in late September, swift and without warning. One morning Silas was splitting wood, his axe ringing against the cool air, his breath steaming, his strength seemingly inexhaustible. By that evening he was burning. The fever hit him like a fist, driving him to his knees, then to his bed, then into a delirium from which he would surface only in brief, terrible moments of clarity. Lorena sat beside him for 3 days and 3 nights. She bathed his forehead with cool water from the creek. She fed him broth that he could not keep down. She held his hand, those massive, rough-skinned hands that had built their world, and felt them tremble like leaves in a storm. There was no doctor. The nearest one was in Ridgewater, 20 miles away, and by the time Lorena considered sending Holt to fetch him, the roads were already thick with early mud and Silas was already too far gone. He died on a Tuesday morning, just as the sun cleared the eastern ridge and poured golden light through the cabin window onto their bed. His last coherent words, spoken sometime in the gray hour before dawn, were not the grand declarations of a dying man in a novel. They were simple and devastating. "I'm sorry, Laurie. I should have told you." She did not know what he meant. Not then. They buried him on the hill behind the cabin, beneath an aspen tree whose leaves had turned the color of old gold. Holt dug the grave because Lorena's hands were shaking too badly to hold the shovel. Colette stood at the graveside, her face a mask of granite, her eyes dry. She had buried a husband of her own. She knew that grief was not a thing you performed. It was a thing that lived inside you, quiet and permanent, like a second heartbeat. Beckett lay beside the grave for 2 days. He would not eat. He would not come inside. He simply lay there, his great head resting on his paws, his golden eyes fixed on the freshly turned earth, as if waiting for
Don't
the
you
man
worry now.
beneath
This
it
old
to
cabin
come
has
back
seen
and throw
worse.
a stick to laugh that big laugh,
Rest
to say
easy,
his name in
Colette.
that particular
Beckett
way
is
that
watching
meant
the door.
world was right. On the 3rd day he came inside, walked directly to Lorena, and pressed his head against her hand. He did not leave her side again. It was Colette who found the loose floorboard. She was sweeping a week after the funeral when the broom caught on a raised edge. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, were the loan papers and the notebook. Lorena read the loan papers first. The words blurred and swam, but their meaning was a cold blade. $400. The land as collateral, past due upon the death of the borrower. She looked up at Colette, her face white. He borrowed against our home, she said. The words tasted like ash. Colette took the papers, read them with the careful precision of a woman who had learned long ago that documents are weapons.
We have to
and
move, hurry!
set them down.
I'm trying,
He was
it
trying
hurts!
to save us, Colette said, not an excuse, a fact. Then Lorena opened their notebook. The maps meant nothing to her crude drawings of ridge lines and creek beds, arrows pointing to places she did not recognize. But the final entry stopped her cold. I have seen it, but I need more time. Seen what? She turned the pages back, looking for context for explanation. There were references to creek beds, to rock formations, to colors in the stone. The word assay appeared twice. But there was no conclusion, no revelation. The notebook was a story without an ending, a map to a destination that was never named. She tucked it into the pocket of her coat along with Silas's old prospecting pen, a battered tin thing that had been a wedding gift from his father. She did not know why she kept them, perhaps because they were the last pieces of a man who had tried in his quiet, desperate way to build something permanent in a world that was not interested in permanence. Declan Whitmore arrived 7 days after the funeral. He came on a grey morning, when the sky was the color of wet slate, and the first true cold of autumn had put a rime of frost on the grass. His horse was a sleek bay mare, well fed and groomed, and it picked its way up the muddy track to the cabin with the fastidious distaste of an animal accustomed to better roads. Behind Whitmore, on a rangy sorrel gelding, rode a man Lorena had never seen. He was lean and angular, all sharp edges and economy of movement, like a tool designed for a single brutal purpose. His face was weathered to the color of old saddle leather, and his eyes were the flat, dispassionate gray of a winter sky. He wore no expression at all. He simply watched the way a hawk watches from a high branch, patient and precise. His name was Kessler, just Kessler. No one in Ridgewater knew his first name, or if they did, they never used it. He was a man who did things for other men, things that required a certain moral flexibility. A tracker, a collector, a solver of problems that polite society preferred to solve at a distance. Whitmore dismounted with the careful precision of a man who did not enjoy horses but understood their necessity. He brushed trail dust from his coat, adjusted his hat, and approached the cabin porch where Lorena stood, her arms crossed, Beckett growling low at her side. Mrs. Calloway. He began removing his hat in a gesture of courtesy so practiced it had lost all sincerity. My condolences on your loss. Lorena said nothing. Behind her, through the open door, she could feel Colette's presence, watching, listening, a coiled stillness. Whitmore reached into his watching, listening, a coiled stillness. Whitmore reached into his leather folio and produced the deed, the loan agreement, the payment schedule. He laid them out on the porch railing like a doctor presenting a diagnosis. Your husband borrowed $400 against this property last August. The note was due upon his passing or by next summer, whichever came first. I'm afraid it has come due. I know what he borrowed, Lorena said. Her voice was steady, but her hands, hidden in the folds of her skirt, were trembling. Then you understand the situation. Whitmore's pale eyes moved past her, scanning the cabin, the fallow field, the timbered mountainside behind them. He was not seeing a home, he was seeing square footage, harvestable timber, water access. He was seeing a solution to his own deepening financial problems back east. I am not an unreasonable man, he said. Lorena would later reflect that this phrase, spoken by a certain kind of man, was always the preamble to an act of profound unreasonableness. You have until the first heavy snow to vacate the premises. After that, this property reverts to me as is stipulated in the agreement your husband signed. He gestured toward the mountains, that dark serrated wall against the sky peaks already dusted with white. No one will want to cross those passes once the snow flies. I suggest you are well gone before then. Kessler had not spoken a word during the entire exchange. He sat on his horse motionless, his flat grey eyes moving between Lorena and the cabin and the mountains beyond. He was reading the landscape the way a predator reads terrain, noting exits,
Look,
obstacles,
the survey
subtle
says the
signs
East Cliff.
that told
We
the
must
story
go
most
now.
people could not hear. His gaze lingered on Lorena
Dig.
for a long
He's
moment, not with
Keep
interest,
digging.
with assessment, as if he were filing her away, cataloging the set of her jaw, the way her hand rested on the dog's neck, the almost imperceptible bulge in her coat pocket where the notebook sat. He saw something there, a piece that did not fit. He filed it away and said nothing. They left. The sound of hooves on the frozen ground faded, and then there was only the wind and the vast, indifferent silence of the mountains. Lorena stood on the porch for a long time. Colette came out and stood beside her. Neither spoke. Beckett pressed his body against Lorena's legs, a warm, solid weight. Finally, Colette said, "How long do we have?" "Weeks, maybe less," he said, "until the first heavy snow." Colette looked up at the sky, at the mountains, at the clouds building in the north. "Then we had better start packing."
It cracked.
"And go where?"
It actually cracked
It was the
open.
question that had no answer. The question
Get
that hung in
inside,
the air
quickly.
between them like the cold itself. They had no family elsewhere. No money, no friends beyond Holt, who had his own struggles and his own patch of unforgiving ground to tend. The world beyond this valley was vast and indifferent, and they were two women alone in it. "North," Colette said, "over the pass. There are settlements on the other side, mining towns. We can find work. We can find a roof. The pass will be closed in weeks. Then we go before it closes." There was something in Colette's voice, a hardness, a finality that brooked no argument. Lorena looked at her mother, this small, bent woman with her sharp eyes and her sharper will, and saw something she had not noticed before. Not fragility, steel, the kind of steel that is forged not in fire but in endurance, in the daily, relentless act of surviving one more day. A choice between a quick death out there and a slow one begging in a town square. Colette said, her voice thin but hard as flint. "I'll take the honest cold." It was old Holt who came to see them off. He arrived on the morning of their departure, leading his own bony mule, which he offered to them without ceremony. He was a man whose face was a topographic map of hard living, every line a drought, every crease a winter survived. He was practical to the point of grimness, the kind of man who would tell you the truth even when the truth was a thing no one wanted to hear. He pressed a small parcel of dried venison into Lorena's hand and an extra wool blanket into Colette's. He looked at them with eyes that held a complex mixture of pity and respect, the gaze of a man who understood that courage and foolishness were often the same thing, separated only by outcome. "The trail north is madness in this weather," he said, his words puffs of vapor in the frigid air. "You'll not make it 10 miles. "We have no choice," Lorena said. Holt shook his head. He looked at Colette, frail and ancient. He looked at Lorena, young but shadowed by a grief too large for her frame. He looked at the mountains, those implacable titans of stone and ice. "The mountains don't forgive," he said. "They don't care who you are." There was something in his voice that snagged at Lorena, a roughness that was not just emotion but something else. Guilt, perhaps, or the foreknowledge of a betrayal already set in motion. Because here is the truth that Lorena did not know and would not know for many months. Old Holt was not simply a kind neighbor doing a kind thing. He was a man caught in his own quiet desperation.
In here!
His wife
Quickly
Edna
now!
had been sick for over a year, a slow wasting illness
It's
that
freezing.
no amount of herbs or
Help me
prayers
with
could
her.
touch. The medicine she needed came from Ridgewater, and the medicine cost money, and the money came from Declan Whitmore, who held Holt's debt as casually as he held everyone else's. 3 hours after Lorena and Colette disappeared into the swirling snow, Holt rode to Ridgewater. He sat in Whitmore's office, turning his hat in his hands, and he told him what Silas Calloway had said to him one evening over a shared bottle of whiskey, about the high creeks, about the colors in the rock, about something Silas had seen but would not name. Hall did not think of himself as a betrayer. He thought of himself as a man making an impossible choice between his loyalty to a neighbor and his love for a dying wife. The world is full of such choices, and they are never clean. Whitmore listened.
Get caught.
His pale
We have
eyes sharpened.
fire.
He turned to Kessler, who sat in the corner like a shadow with a pulse, and said, "Find them." But all of
We
that
made
was
it.
happening in the world below, in the world of ledgers and debts and quiet treacheries. In the world above, in the high country where the air was thin and the snow was deep and the mountains did not care about the affairs of men, Lorena and Colette were fighting for their lives. They left the cabin without looking back. To look back was to invite a despair so vast it would swallow them whole. The snow swirled around them, covering their tracks almost as soon as they were made, erasing them from the landscape, from memory, from the world of the living. Beckett forged ahead, a dark shape against the blinding white, his powerful body breaking trail through snow that reached his chest. He moved with purpose, with an almost supernatural certainty, as if he could see a path that was invisible to human eyes.
My God.
The mule carried what little they had. A few sacks
Look
of
at the
flour,
size
salted
of this
pork,
place.
blankets, the axe,
How far does
Silas's
it go?
prospecting pan, the notebook tucked inside Lorena's coat against her heart. They climbed. The world shrank. The first day was endurable. The trail was still visible in places, and the snow, though heavy, fell in a steady, almost peaceful curtain. They made perhaps 5 miles, following a creek bed that wound upward through a narrow canyon. They found shelter that night beneath an overhanging rock, built a small fire from dead branches Beckett had helped drag from beneath the drifts, and ate a meal of jerky and melted snow. Colette was quiet. She ate little, drank less, and sat with her back against the rock, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. Lorena watched her mother and felt the first cold finger of real fear touch her heart. Not the fear of the storm or the cold or the unknown. The fear of losing the last person in the world who knew her name. The second day, the storm worsened. The wind came down from the peaks like a living thing, a howling, shrieking force that drove the snow horizontally, turning the air into a white, scouring sandstorm of ice. Visibility dropped to nothing. The trail vanished. The world became a featureless void, a white room with no walls and no floor and no ceiling, just wind and cold and the terrible disorienting sensation of moving without knowing if you were going up or down, forward or in circles. The mule stopped. It was not dramatic. There was no final cry, no struggle. The animal simply stopped walking, sank to its knees in the deep snow with a soft, exhausted sigh, and lowered its head. Its eyes, dark and liquid, held a look of weary acceptance, the look of a creature that had reached the end of its willingness to fight. Lorena tried to pull it up. She shouted, she pulled at the halter, she begged. The mule did not move. Its breathing slowed, and then with a gentleness that was almost graceful, it lay down on its side in the snow, closed its eyes, and was still. They took what they could carry. Lorena strapped the heaviest pack to her own back, looped a rope around her waist, and tied the other end to Colette and pressed on. Beckett stayed close now, no longer ranging ahead, but walking at Lorena's side, his body pressed against her leg, a warm anchor in the formless chaos. Colette fell twice. The first time Lorena hauled her up, brushed the snow from her coat, looked into her mother's eyes, and saw behind the ice crystals on her eyelashes a determination that was almost frightening in its intensity. The second time, Colette did not get up immediately. She lay in the snow, her breathing rapid and shallow, her face the color of old candle wax. "Leave me,"
A
she
waterfall.
whispered. "Don't you dare."
Underground.
She lifted her mother. She did
It's
not
a
know
miracle.
where the strength came from.
We're safe
Colette weighed
now.
almost nothing, a bundle of bones and will wrapped in wet wool, but the effort of carrying her through waist-deep snow against the wind that seemed determined to tear them apart was a physical trial that bordered on the impossible. They found the lean-to by accident. It was nothing. A few old timbers propped against a rock faced the remnants of some long-departed trapper's camp. But it broke the wind, and in the relative shelter of its crude walls, Lorena built a fire. That fire lasted 4 hours, 4 hours of flickering precious warmth in the howling darkness. 4 hours during which Lorena held Colette and Colette held Lorena, and Beckett lay across their feet, his body heat, a gift more valuable than gold. And then the fire died, and here we are back where we began, the darkness, the cold, the dying ember. Lorena sat in that lean-to, in that silence that follows the death of a fire, and she understood with a terrible clarity that they were going to die. Not someday, not eventually, tonight. The cold would take Colette first, then Lorena, then even Beckett, who was stronger than both of them, but not stronger than the mountain in winter. She closed her eyes. She thought of Silas, his laugh, his hands, the way he said her name, stretching out the middle syllable like he was savoring it. She thought of the cabin he had built, each log a promise. She thought of the notebook and its cryptic final entry, and the life he had tried so desperately to build for them, a life that now seemed as distant and unreachable as the stars hidden behind the storm clouds above. And then Beckett moved. He had been lying still, conserving
Finally,
warmth, but now
some
he rose
warmth.
to his feet in a single fluid motion. He was not shivering. His
We're
disquiet
safe
was a
now.
deeper thing, a low
At least for a
growl
while.
that vibrated in his chest, the sound of urgent, desperate purpose. He pushed his cold nose into Lorena's hand, hard, insistent. He pulled at the hem of her sleeve gently but firmly, his teeth gripping the fabric. He's just cold, Colette murmured. But Lorena saw it was more than that. There was a certainty in the dog's posture, an unwavering conviction. He was not restless. He was demanding. His golden eyes burned with an intelligence that felt ancient, primal, a knowledge that predated language, that lived in the blood and the bone. He pulled her toward the opening of the lean-to, toward the full murderous force of the blizzard. Every instinct Lorena possessed screamed at her to stay, to huddle, to conserve what little warmth remained. Going out there was madness. Going out there was suicide. Beckett, no, she said. He barked, a single sharp command, and then he did something that would haunt Lorena for the rest of her life. He turned and looked at Colette. He looked at her for a long moment, his golden eyes meeting her ancient fading ones, and something passed between them. An understanding, a promise. Then he turned back to Lorena and pulled again. Follow him, Colette whispered. Mama, we can't. We'll die out there. We'll die in here. Colette's voice was barely audible, but the steel was still there, buried deep beneath the cold and the exhaustion. At least out there we die moving. Lorena lifted Colette onto her back. She did not think about it. She did not calculate the odds or weigh the options. She simply stood, took the weight of her mother onto her shoulders, and followed the dog into the storm. The wind hit them like a wall. It stole Lorena's breath, drove ice crystals into her eyes, tried to rip Colette from her back. She could see nothing, nothing. The world was white, a screaming, scouring emptiness without form or direction. She followed Beckett by sound alone, the steady crunch of his paws in the snow ahead of her, a metronome of purpose in the chaos. He led them along the base of a massive rock wall, a sheer cliff face that rose into the darkness above them, offering no shelter, no hope, just an endless expanse of cold stone. The wind channeled between the rocks and the open air, creating a corridor of concentrated fury that threatened to sweep them off the narrow ledge they were traversing. Lorena's legs were failing. Her arms wrapped around Colette's legs were numb. Her back was a single screaming nerve of pain. She could not feel her feet. She was moving on nothing but will, and the will was running out. Just as she was about to fall to simply let her knees buckle and surrender to the white darkness, Beckett stopped. He stood before a section of the cliff that looked exactly like every other section. A flat, featureless expanse of granite, unremarkable, invisible. And he began to dig. His paws worked the snow. With frantic energy, his body low, his tail straight behind him, and from his throat came a sound Lorena had never heard from him before, a whine of joyful urgency. She fell to her knees beside him, her frozen hands clawing at the drift, scraping away snow and ice with fingers she could no longer feel. Beneath the snow there was a shadow, a crack, a fissure in the rock face no wider than a man's shoulders, hidden behind a slight outcropping that made it invisible from any angle unless you were standing directly before it, and from that fissure came a breath. A breath of air, not warm but discernibly less cold than the killing wind that howled around them. Air that smelled of damp earth and deep stone, of places untouched by winter, of the mountain's own secret interior. It was an exhalation from the heart of the earth. Lorena squeezed through the fissure, first pulling Colette behind her. It was a tight, scraping passage, the rock clutching at their clothes, their skin as if reluctant to admit them to its most private chamber. Beckett came last, his broad chest barely fitting through the gap, his first scraping against stone, and then they were inside. The moment they crossed the threshold, the roar of the blizzard was severed, cut off as if by a closing door. The silence that replaced it was so sudden, so absolute, that Lorena staggered, disoriented by the absence of sound after hours of constant deafening noise. The only sounds in this new world were their own ragged breathing, the frantic hammering of their hearts, and a distant, deep rhythm, a pulse, steady, resonant, ancient, as if the mountain itself had a heartbeat and they had crawled inside its chest to hear it. It was not a cave, it was a cathedral. The darkness was immense, a vast velvety black that pressed against them from all sides, ancient and alive and full of secrets. Lorena's fingers, clumsy and numb, fumbled with the tinderbox she had carried in her coat. After several agonizing attempts, a spark caught. The tiny flame of their lantern trembled, then grew, pushing back the darkness, not in a great flood of light, but in a small, courageous circle, a tiny island of gold in an ocean of black. The light touched stone, walls that soared upward into a gloom the lantern could
We
not
must find
penetrate.
shelter
A
soon,
ceiling so
ma'am.
high it was not a ceiling at all,
I
but a
don't think
sky
I
of
can
rock,
make it.
invisible and infinite. The floor beneath them was smooth, worn by water over millennia, and the air was cool but not frigid, not deadly. It was the temperature of a deep cellar, a root cellar, a place where the earth kept its own counsel and maintained its own steady warmth, regardless of what madness raged on the surface above. Beckett's tail wagged. He moved ahead, his nails clicking on the stone floor, his head high, his body relaxed. He was not exploring, he was leading. He knew the way. They followed him deeper. The floor sloped gently downward, and the pulsing sound grew louder, becoming a rumble, then a roar. They rounded a colossal pillar of stone, a natural column thicker than the oldest tree in the valley, and the lantern light caught something that glittered and moved. Water. A waterfall. A secret river pouring from a high unseen cleft in the cavern ceiling, plunging in a solid shimmering column into a deep black pool. Its spray created a fine perpetual mist that hung in the air like a veil, and the sound of it, that deep resonant thunder, was the heartbeat they had been hearing. The mountain's pulse, the mountain's living core. The water was wide, the air was not frozen. The immense volume of moving water, combined with some deep geothermal warmth rising from the earth's interior, kept this vast chamber in a state of eternal temperate twilight. It was not warm, not by any standard of comfort, but it was alive, it was survivable. It was the difference between death and one more day. Lorena set Colette down on a flat stone near the pool. She wrapped her mother in every blanket. They had built a small fire from the few sticks of wood still in her pack and held Colette's hands until the trembling stopped. The fire reflected off the water reflected off the stone soared into darkness, and the waterfall thundered on, indifferent to their presence, indifferent to their suffering, indifferent to everything but the ancient, unchanging business of being a river inside a mountain. They were alive. Have you ever been granted a miracle so large it frightens you? A reprieve so unexpected, so unearned, that your first reaction is not gratitude but terror. That is what Lorena felt, sitting on that cold stone floor, listening to the heartbeat of the mountain, watching the firelight dance on the surface of a subterranean pool. She was terrified, not of the dark, not of the unknown depths of the cave. She was terrified because, for the first time since Silas died, she felt something she had thought was gone forever: hope. And hope, when you have learned to live without it, is the most frightening thing of all.
With
Because
this
it means you have
ring, I
something to lose again.
promise
It
to
means the world
stand
can
by
hurt you again. It
you
means you are alive, truly
always.
And I
alive.
promise
And the
to
price
love
of
you
being alive
fiercely
is that
every
nothing is certain, nothing is guaranteed, and the next breath might bring salvation or ruin. Colette opened her eyes. She looked at the vast cavern, at the shimmering waterfall, at the fire, at her daughter's face illuminated by its light. And for the first time in weeks, the old woman smiled. "Well," she said, her voice a thin rasp, "it appears the mountain has decided we are worth keeping." Beckett lay down at their feet, his great body spanning the space between them like a bridge, his head on his paws, his golden eyes reflecting the firelight. His tail thumped once against the stone. He had brought them home. In the days that followed, survival became a rhythm, a drum beat set by the ceaseless thunder of the waterfall. The initial awe, that breathless, trembling wonder at the sheer improbability of their survival, gave way to something more practical, more human, the business of staying alive. The cavern was a geological marvel, a cathedral carved by water and time over millennia. The main chamber, dominated by the waterfall and its deep black pool, was immense, larger than any town hall or church Lorena had ever seen. The ceiling vanished into impenetrable darkness far above, so high that when she shouted, the echo took a full 3 seconds to return, altered and strange, as if the mountain were answering in a language she did not speak. But wonder does not keep you warm. Wonder does not fill an empty stomach. And in those first days, the practical realities of their situation pressed in from all sides with a weight almost as heavy as the stone itself. They had almost nothing: a few handfuls of flour, a strip of salted pork, 2 blankets, a tinder box with perhaps a dozen strikes left, the axe, Silas's prospecting pan, the notebook in Lorena's pocket, its secret still unread, still waiting. Colette could not walk without help. The ordeal of the blizzard had drained the last reserves from her 72-year-old body, and she sat by the small fire Lorena built from the last of their carried wood, her face pale, her breathing shallow, her eyes following her daughter's movements with a mixture of pride and concern. "Stop fussing over me," she said on the second morning when Lorena tried to give her the larger share of their dwindling food. "I'm old, not helpless. Eat. You'll need the strength more than I will." It was true. Because on that second morning, Lorena stood at the edge of the subterranean pool, looked at the vast, dark space around them, and made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would not simply survive here, she would build. The first task was fire. Without it, they had nothing. The small supply of wood they had carried was nearly gone. And the cavern, for all its miraculous warmth, was still cool enough that a night without fire would mean a slow creeping hypothermia that would take Colette first and Lorena soon after. She left the cavern on the third day. Squeezing back through the narrow fissure was like being born in reverse, a tight, scraping passage from the warm dark into the blinding, hostile light. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world so white and still it seemed painted, a landscape of pure, unbroken snow beneath a sky of porcelain blue. The silence outside was different from the silence inside. Outside, it was the silence of aftermath of exhaustion, the world catching its breath after the violence of the storm.
Oh, what a
Inside, it had been the
precious little
silence of
thing.
permanence, of
Look
things that
at
had been
him.
silent for
You
10,000
poor little
years and would be
darling, you're
silent for
safe
10,000 more.
now.
Lorena stood at the entrance to their hidden world and looked out at the mountainside. Below her, far below the valley where their cabin had stood, was invisible beneath the snow. The trees, dark pines and skeletal aspens, stood in ranks down the slope like soldiers, frozen at attention. Dead wood, seasoned and dry, lay scattered among them, brought down by storms and winters past. She took the axe and went to work. It was brutal. There is no other word for it. She was not a large woman, not built for this kind of labor. Her hands, blistered on the first day, bled on the second, and by the third had begun to form the thick, hard calluses would become a permanent feature of her palms, a new skin for her new life. She felled the dead pines,
look at
stripped them
him
of their
go!
branches, and cut them into lengths she could manage. Each swing of the axe sent a
He's all
shock through her
paws,
arms and
isn't
shoulders
he?
that she felt in her teeth. But with each swing, something else happened, something she did not expect. A piece of the old Lorena fell away. The woman who had stood on her porch and listened to Declan Whitmore pronounce sentence on her life. The woman who had wept into her hands after the burial, the woman who had whispered, "We have no choice," with the voice of someone who had already surrendered. That woman was dying axe stroke by axe stroke, and in her place something harder was emerging, something tempered by cold and loss, and the sheer stubborn refusal to stop swinging. Getting the logs to the cave was the greatest challenge. The slope was steep, treacherous, with loose rock beneath the snow, and the fissure entrance was narrow enough that each log had to be fed through at a precise angle.
And so they rested by
She
the
and Beckett
river,
worked
the
as a
day's
team,
journey behind
Lorena
them,
pushing,
thankful
Beckett
for the
pulling, his
quiet
powerful
evening
jaws
and the
gripping
shelter of the
ropes
trees.
she fashioned from strips of blanket and bark. It was a painstaking, exhausting process. A single log could take half a day. Colette waited inside, keeping the fire, preparing their meals from the dwindling supplies, her presence a quiet, steady beacon. She never complained. She never asked how long it would take or whether it was possible. She simply kept the fire burning and waited for her daughter to come back through the fissure each evening, snow-covered and trembling with exhaustion, and she would hand her a cup of hot water with a few precious grains of salt dissolved in it and say, "Tell me what you built today." And Lorena would tell her, and the telling made it real. The cabin began to take shape in a wide level area, a safe distance from the waterfall's mists. Lorena
The
built
ditch
it
is
with a
almost
slow,
dry,
deliberate
Silas.
patience she
I
had
know.
learned from watching Silas
The
notching
well
the
won't
logs to
last much
fit
longer.
together, filling the gaps with a mixture of mud and moss scraped from the damp corners of the cavern. She made mistakes. She made many mistakes. Logs that did not fit, notches cut too deep or not deep enough, walls that leaned and had to be torn down and rebuilt. But she learned. The wood taught her, the stone taught her, and somewhere in the back of her mind she could hear Silas's voice, patient and warm, explaining how a joint should sit, how weight should be distributed, how a wall becomes strong, not through the strength of any single log, but through the way each one supports the others. It was a small structure when it was finished, a single room with a sleeping loft, not unlike the cabin Silas had built in the valley, but rougher, simpler, built by hands that were learning rather than hands that already knew. It had a door that closed, a floor of smooth planks, two small window openings that looked out not upon the sky but upon the eternal gentle twilight of their stone world and the shimmering curtain of the waterfall. Colette stood in the doorway of the finished cabin, her hand on the rough-hewn frame, and looked at her daughter with an expression Lorena had never seen before. It was not pride exactly, it was recognition. The recognition of one survivor looking at another and seeing the same unbreakable thing staring back. "Your father would not believe this," Colette said quietly. "Silas would," Lorena answered, and that was enough. It was while gathering stones for the hearth that Lorena made the discovery. She was near the edge of the pool, prying flat stones from the damp earth where the waterfall's mist kept everything perpetually wet. Her fingers brushed against something different, a rock that was heavier than it should have been, veined with a peculiar dull yellow luster. She almost dismissed it. Pyrite. Fool's gold. The mountains were full of it, a common trick of the earth, a shining lie that had broken the hearts of 1,000 prospectors. But something made her pause. A memory. Silas sitting by the fire in their old cabin, turning a piece of rock in his hands, explaining the difference. Pyrite sparkles, he had said. It's brittle, it breaks. Real gold doesn't sparkle, it glows. And it doesn't break, it bends. Lorena took a larger stone and struck the yellow vein. It did not shatter, it did not spark, it dented. A soft buttery gleam appeared in the firelight, warm and heavy and unmistakable. She took the lantern and held it close to the rock face bordering the pool. Her breath stopped. It was not a single vein. The entire wall was a lattice of gold. Thick ropey bands of pure elemental metal woven through white quartz like veins, through marble running in every direction, branching and merging and branching again. It was a geological fortune, a mother lode that any mining company in Colorado would have killed for, a secret the mountain had kept locked in its stone heart for millions of years. She took Silas's prospecting pan, the battered tin thing she had carried for reasons she could not explain, and scooped a pan full of silt and gravel from the bottom of the pool. She swirled it the way she had seen Silas do 100 times, the water washing away the lighter material, and in the bottom of the pan, gleaming in the lantern light, was a breathtaking smear of heavy, glittering dust and small nuggets. The notebook. The final entry. I have seen it, but I need more time. He had known. Silas had found the source or come close to it, and he had died before he could return. The pen and the notebook had been his legacy, a map to a treasure he had never been able to claim. Lorena held a nugget the size of her thumb and carried it to Colette. Her mother took it, weighed it in her palm, held it up to the firelight, and studied it with the calm, appraising eye of a woman who had lived long enough to know the difference between what glitters and what matters. It's pretty, Colette said. Her voice was flat. Mama, it's gold, real gold. There's a fortune in these walls. Can you eat it? No, but will it keep you warm tonight? No. Will it mend a broken heart? Lorena was silent. Colette set the nugget down on the stone floor beside the fire. She looked around the vast dark space, at the small cabin, at the flickering hearth, at Beckett
Welcome
sleeping with
home,
his nose tucked
Silas.
under
We
his
missed
tail.
you.
Here, she said, it is just yellow rock. Survival is the only
Evening,
treasure that
Lorena.
matters.
It's good to
The
be
words
back.
landed like a stone, dropped into deep water. They sank through Lorena's excitement, through the sudden, dizzying vision of wealth and freedom and revenge on every man who had ever looked at her with pity or contempt, and settled at the bottom of her consciousness where they would stay, a foundation, an anchor, a truth so simple it was almost invisible. The gold was not their salvation, the cave was. The gold was just a secret the mountain had told them, and secrets, Colette understood, are only valuable when they are kept. The discovery changed nothing about their daily lives, and yet it changed everything about their future. It was a silent promise, a guarantee written in stone that they would never again be at the mercy of men like Whitmore. But Colette's words had been a potent note, and the focus remained with monastic discipline on the immediate, on life, on warmth, on the next meal, on building a home, beneath a roof, beneath a mountain. The weeks turned, the routine deepened, and then in the dead of winter the mountain tested them again. Colette had been coughing for 3 days, a dry, persistent sound that echoed off the cavern walls and made Beckett raise his head and whine each time it came. Lorena told herself it was the damp air, the mist from the waterfall, the change in climate. She told herself it would pass. It did not pass. On the fourth night, Lorena woke to a sound that drove a spike of ice through her heart. Not the coughing, something worse. A wet gurgling rasp, the sound of lungs filling with fluid of breath being slowly, inexorably stolen. She lit the lantern and turned to her mother. Colette's face was the color of old tallow. Her lips had a bluish tint. Her eyes, when she opened them, were glassy and unfocused, and the heat radiating from her skin was so intense that Lorena recoiled instinctively before forcing herself to move closer to hold her mother's burning hand. Mama, I'm fine, Colette whispered and then coughed, and the cloth she held to her mouth came away spotted with red. It was pneumonia. Lorena knew it with a certainty that was itself a kind of illness, a sickness of knowledge, the terrible clarity of understanding exactly what was happening and being powerless to stop it. Colette drifted. Consciousness became a tide coming and going in irregular waves. In her lucid moments, she was herself sharp and dry and utterly without self-pity. "Stop looking at me like I am already in the ground," she said once, and the flash of irritation in her eyes was so familiar, so completely Colette, that Lorena almost laughed. But in the spaces between, when the fever rose and the walls between waking and dreaming dissolved, Colette spoke of things she had never spoken of before. She spoke of a man, not Lorena's father. A man before him, a man whose name she said only once in a whisper that seemed to cost her something fundamental. She spoke of being young, younger than Lorena was now, and of being turned out of a house that was not hers with a child in her arms who was not yet a year old. She spoke of a winter, a different mountain, but the same cold, the same desperate scramble for survival. She spoke of the child dying. The words came out flat and broken, stripped of all emotion by decades of careful burial. A daughter before Lorena, born in a bad time to a bad man and lost on a frozen road in a state
Look
Colette
there!
would never name, in a
Gold!
year she would never count.
Pay dirt.
I carried her
Finally
for 2
found the
days
mother
after she
lode.
stopped breathing, Colette said, her voice a dry leaf scraping across stone. Because I could not put her down, because putting her down meant she was gone, and I was not ready for her to be gone. Lorena sat in the firelight holding her mother's hand and felt the architecture of her understanding shift. The woman she had known her entire life, the sharp-tongued, steel-spined matriarch, who seemed to have been born old and tough, had been forged in a crucible. Lorena was only now beginning to understand. Colette's strength was not natural, it was built from loss, from grief, from the terrible patient work of surviving one unbearable day after another until the unbearable became merely painful and the painful became merely permanent. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Lorena whispered. "Because some things are not stories," Colette murmured, her eyes closing. "They are just scars, and scars don't need audiences." Lorena needed medicine. Yarrow for the fever, pine needle tea for the lungs, willow bark for the pain. She knew these things because Colette herself had taught her years ago in the old cabin, pointing out the plants on their walks through the valley, explaining their uses with the practical authority of a woman who had doctored herself and her family long before she had ever seen the inside of a pharmacy. But finding them in winter on a frozen mountainside was another matter entirely. She left the cabin before Dawn Beckett at her side. The world outside was still and white, the sky a hard, clear blue that promised cold so deep it would crack a stone. She moved through the trees searching for the plants she needed, scraping snow from the bases of trunks, digging into frozen ground with numb fingers. She found the yarrow first, a frozen cluster of dry stalks in a sheltered hollow. The willow bark she stripped from a stand of trees along a frozen creek bed, her knife scraping long, thin curls of medicine from the grey wood. The pine needles she gathered from the lower branches of a massive ponderosa, its trunk so thick she could not have wrapped her arms around it. It was on the way back, climbing the steep slope toward the hidden fissure, her pack full of frozen herbs and her body trembling with cold and fatigue, that the wolves found them. There were 3 of them, grey shapes against the white snow, moving with the fluid, unhurried grace of animals that know they are at the top of their world. They materialized from a stand of trees below her on the slope, fanning out with a coordination that was almost choreographed, cutting off the downhill road with a casual efficiency that said they had done this many times before. Beckett saw them first. He stopped. The fur along his spine rose in a dark ridge, and from his throat came a sound that was not a growl, but something deeper, something older, a warning that predated dogs and wolves and spoke directly to the ancient part of the brain where survival instinct lives. The wolves stopped too. They were not large, winter had thinned them, but their eyes held the flat yellow calculation of hunger. They assessed. The dog was big, strong, the human was small, tired, the pack had done the math. The lead wolf moved first. It came up the slope in a rush, silent, its body low aimed not at Lorena, but at her pack, at the smell of food. Beckett intercepted it. The collision was violent, a snarling, snapping tangle of fur and teeth that sent snow spraying in all directions. Beckett outweighed the wolf, but the wolf was wild, was desperate, and its teeth found the soft flesh of Beckett's shoulder and tore. The dog yelped. The sound was a blade in Lorena's chest. The second wolf circled. It was flanking, coming at Lorena from the side while Beckett was engaged. She could see it in her peripheral vision, a grey shape moving through the trees, patient and precise. She did not think. She pulled the axe from her belt and swung. The blade caught the second wolf across the muzzle, a glancing blow that was more shock than damage, but enough to send the animal skidding backward in the snow, shaking its head, a thin line of blood tracing across its snout. It retreated 3 steps, stopped, stared at her with those flat yellow eyes, recalculated. Lorena screamed, not a scream of terror, but a scream of rage, a raw, tearing sound that came from some deep prehistoric place inside her, the sound of a woman who had lost too much already and could not lose anything more. She swung the axe again, a wide sweeping arc, and advanced on the wolf. It broke. The calculation shifted. This was no longer easy prey. This was something dangerous, something unpredictable. The wolf turned and ran, and the third wolf, which had been circling behind, followed. The lead wolf, still tangled with Beckett, disengaged. Beckett's teeth had found its ear, tearing a ragged notch, and the wolf twisted free with a yelp of pain and frustration. It backed away, blood dripping from its torn ear, its eyes fixed on Lorena and the axe she held in her blistered hands. Then it too turned and melted into the trees, and the 3 grey shapes vanished into the white landscape as silently as they had appeared. Beckett was bleeding, a deep gash in his shoulder, the flesh torn in a ragged crescent that exposed the dark muscle beneath. He stood in the snow, his legs slightly splayed, panting, his golden eyes never leaving the tree line where the wolves had disappeared. "Come here," Lorena said, her voice shaking. "Come here, boy." He came. He limped to her and pressed his great bloodied head against her thigh, and she knelt in the snow and wrapped her arms around him and held him and felt his heart beating fast and strong against her chest. She carried the herbs and half carried the dog back to the cavern. The fissure entrance, that narrow crack in the rock that had saved their lives, had never looked so much like a doorway to heaven. She squeezed through, pulling Beckett gently behind her, and collapsed on the stone floor. Then she went to work. She boiled the yarrow and made Colette drink the bitter tea. She stripped the willow bark and steeped it, dosing her mother every 4 hours with the precision of a field surgeon. She packed Beckett's wound with a poultice of pine resin and moss, binding it with strips torn from her own shirt. She slept in 2-hour intervals, waking to check Colette's breathing, to change the compress on Beckett's shoulder, to feed the fire. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of this. 3 weeks of hovering between life and death, of watching Colette's chest rise and fall and wondering each time if the next breath would come, of changing Beckett's bandages and seeing the slow, terrible red of infection creeping around the edges of the wound before the pine resin finally mercifully beat it back. Colette survived, but she did not recover, not fully. The pneumonia left her lungs scarred, her breathing permanently shallow, her energy diminished to a fraction of what it had been. She could walk slowly, she could sit by the fire and read and talk and be Colette. But the Iron Woman who had marched into a blizzard and said, "I'll take the honest cold," was gone. In her place was someone gentler, quieter, a woman who had come very close to the edge of the world and had been pulled back, and who now viewed each remaining day with the careful appreciation of someone who knows exactly how easily it could all end. Beckett healed faster. Dogs do. Within a month, the gash had closed to a thick raised scar hidden beneath his fur, and he moved with only a slight hitch in his stride that would never fully go away. He had paid a price for their survival written in flesh, and he wore it without complaint. Spring came to the world outside a slow, grudging thaw that softened the snow and sent meltwater cascading down the mountainside in 1,000 tiny streams. Inside the cavern, the change was barely perceptible, a slight increase in the sound of the waterfall, a subtle shift in the air currents flowing through the fissure. But Lorena felt it. The mountain was breathing differently. The season was turning. It was time to test the world. She prepared carefully. She selected 3 small gold nuggets from the pool, each no larger than a pea, and sewed them into the lining of her coat. She dressed in the roughest clothes. She had rubbed dirt into her face and hands and bound her hair beneath a wide-brimmed hat she had fashioned from bark and hide. She looked at herself in the reflection of the still water at the edge of the pool. A stranger looked back. Good. Be careful, Colette said from the cabin doorway. It was not a request, it was an instruction. I will. Don't talk to anyone you don't have to. Don't stay longer than necessary. And don't let anyone see where you come from. Lorena nodded. She knelt beside Beckett and held his great head in her hands. Stay with her, she said. Guard her. The dog's golden eyes met hers. He understood. The town of Broken Creek was 18 miles northwest, a mining settlement. She had never visited, a place where she was no one and knew no one. She reached it in a day and a half of hard walking, sleeping one night in a hollow beneath a fallen pine, and arrived at its muddy main street looking exactly like what she intended to look like, a frontier woman, poor, unremarkable, one of hundreds. She traded the nuggets at a general store run by a man with a beard like a gray waterfall and eyes that asked no questions. In mining country, gold was currency, and its provenance was a subject that polite people and smart people left unexamined. She received in exchange salt, sugar, flour, a small bottle of laudanum, a pouch of loose tea, a new knife, and 2 books, a collection of poetry, and a battered copy of a novel Colette had been wanting. It was in the saloon next door where she stopped to buy a hot meal before the long walk back that she heard the conversation that changed the temperature of her blood. 2 men at the bar, miners, by the look of them mud-caked and weary, talking with the easy volume of men who have had 3 drinks and forgotten that the world has ears. Whitmore sold the Calloway place last month, one said. Got next to nothing for it. The fields are shot and the cabins falling apart. What about the widow? She ever turn up? Dead most likely. Her and the old woman both. Nobody survives a winter in the high passes on foot. Whitmore told the sheriff they were gone. Whitmore's a fool. You hear what Kessler's been doing. Lorena's hand tightened on her cup. Still up there? All winter near enough. Whitmore's got him looking for something. Won't say what, but Kessler's been buying supplies like a man who plans to stay a while. Rope, pitons, lanterns, the kind of gear you buy when you're planning to go underground. Lorena left the saloon without finishing her meal. She walked out of Broken Creek without looking back, and she did not stop walking until she was deep in the trees, far from any trail, far from any eyes. Then she sat down on a rock and let the fear wash over her in a cold, nauseating wave. Kessler was still on the mountain. Kessler, with his flat gray eyes and his predator's patience, was not searching blindly. He was searching systematically. He had rope and pitons and lanterns. He was looking for caves. He was looking for the thing that Silas had found, the thing that Holt, their trusted neighbor, their friend, had described to Whitmore in exchange for medicine for a dying wife. Lorena did not yet know about Holt's betrayal. She did not know that their departure from the valley had been watched, that their trail had been sold, that the information Silas had shared in confidence over a bottle of whiskey had been passed along in a cramped office in Ridgewater like a deed to property that was not Holt's to sell. But she knew Kessler. She had seen his eyes, and she knew with the bone-deep certainty of prey that has scented a predator that he would not stop. The walk back to the cavern took longer than it should have, not because of distance, but because Lorena took a route so circuitous, so deliberately random that no tracker could have followed it. She walked on rock where she could, she crossed streams, she doubled back and approached the hidden fissure from a direction she had never used before. And when she arrived, she found what she had feared: boot prints. Not hers, not any she recognized. Heavy, deliberate prints in the softening spring snow leading along the base of the cliff face, passing within 200 feet of the fissure entrance. And on the rock wall itself, at eye level, a series of small, precise marks. Chisel marks, the kind of marks a man makes when he is mapping a cliff face section by section, looking for anomalies, for cracks, for openings. Kessler had been here. He had walked past their door. He had not found it, not yet. The fissure was invisible unless you stood directly before it, and the slight outcropping that concealed it had done its work. But the marks on the rock told a story of patience and method of a man who was dividing the mountain into a grid and searching it square by square. He would be back. Lorena spent the next 3 days erasing every trace of their existence from the mountainside. She scattered the small wood pile she had built near the entrance. She filled in the faint trail that months of coming and going had worn in the earth. She gathered stones and positioned them in front of the fissure, making it look like a natural fall of rock rather than an opening. She even rubbed dirt and moss into the chisel marks Kessler had left, dulling their sharp edges. From now on, she would leave the cavern only at night. She would vary her route every time. She would never approach the fissure from the same direction twice. She would become invisible. The mountain had given them a secret, and she would keep it with her life. 3 weeks after Lorena returned from Broken Creek on a cool spring evening, when the light outside the fissure had softened to the pale gold of late afternoon, Beckett's growl filled the cavern. It was not the growl he used for the small disturbances, the occasional sound of a rock fall outside or the cry of an eagle echoing off the cliff face. This was the other growl, the deep one, the one that came from the oldest part of him, the part that was still wolf, still wild, still tuned to frequencies that human ears could not detect. Lorena grabbed the iron poker from the hearth. It was her only weapon now, the axe too far away propped against the cabin wall. She motioned for Colette to stay inside and move silently toward the fissure. The sound came first, a horse's whinny, faint but unmistakable, carried on the evening air through the crack in the rock, then a man's voice cursing. She pressed her eye to the narrow gap between the stones she had placed at the entrance. The evening light was diffuse golden, and in it she could see a figure on horseback, perhaps 50 feet from where she stood. He was picking his way along the base of the cliff, his horse stepping carefully on the loose stone, and even at this distance, even in silhouette, she recognized the rigid posture, the careful calculating movements. It was not Kessler, it was Whitmore. He had come himself. Declan Whitmore, the man of ledgers and laws, the man who had looked at their cabin and seen board feet and acreage, had ridden up into the high country to see with his own eyes what Kessler's months of searching had not yet found. He dismounted and stood at the base of the cliff. He was not dressed for the mountains. His coat was too thin, his boots too smooth, his gloves too clean. He looked at the rock face, the way he looked at everything, with the flat, acquisitive gaze of a man who believed that all things given sufficient pressure would yield their value. His eyes swept across the cliff. They passed over the fissure, over the carefully placed stones, over the rubbed out chisel marks. They saw nothing, because Whitmore was a man of straight lines and clear titles, and this wild, chaotic landscape defied his sense of order. He could not conceive of the life hidden within the mountain's heart. He could not imagine a world that existed beyond his ledgers. Beckett's growl deepened. Lorena placed her hand over his muzzle gently but firmly. "Be still," she whispered. Whitmore stood there for what felt like an eternity. He kicked at the snowdrift. A rock skittered down the slope, and the sharp sound echoed off the cliff face like a gunshot. From the north, a dark line of clouds was building a new storm, gathering its forces. Whitmore saw it, his face tightened. The mountain was larger than his ambition, colder than his arithmetic, more patient than his greed. He mounted his horse, he turned, he rode back down the slope. But he did not ride alone, because down below, somewhere in the trees, Kessler was still there. Lorena could not see him, but she knew. She could feel his presence the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, a subtle wrongness, a disturbance in the natural order of things. Whitmore had come and gone, but Kessler remained. Lorena returned to the cabin. Colette sat by the fire, a book open in her lap, her eyes not on the pages but on the door. She had heard everything. The horse, the cursing, the silence that was worse than both. Was it him? Colette asked. The one with the ledgers? Yes. Did he find it? No. But the other one, the hunter, he's still out there. It was not a question. Lorena sat down across from her mother. The fire popped and sent a shower of sparks into the dim air. Beckett lay down between them, his injured shoulder to the warmth, his golden eyes moving from one face to the other. Some men are not meant for the high places, Colette said quietly. Whitmore will give up. His kind always does. They are built for offices and courtrooms, not for stone and wind. She paused. Her eyes, ancient and sharp, met Lorena's. But the hunter, he is different. He is built for this, and he will not stop until he finds what he is looking for, or until something stops him. Lorena looked at the fire. She looked at the cabin she had built with her own hands. She looked at the walls of the cavern soaring into darkness, the waterfall thundering its eternal song, the gold glinting in the lamplight like the mountain's own secret laughter. She had built a home. She had saved her mother. She had fought wolves and survived the blizzard and carved a life from stone. But the world outside had not forgotten them. And it was coming. Spring opened the mountain like a wound. The snow retreated slowly, grudgingly pulling back from the slopes in jagged patches that revealed the dark, wet earth beneath. Meltwater ran everywhere, cascading down rock faces, pooling in hollows, turning the mountainside into a network of tiny glittering streams that carried the winter away in 1,000 silver threads. The trees, those dark pines and skeletal aspens that had stood like sentinels through the long cold, began to stir. Buds appeared, birds returned, the world was remembering how to be alive. But for Lorena, the thaw was not a liberation, it was an exposure. Winter had been their ally. The snow had covered their tracks, buried their scent, sealed the mountain in a white fortress that kept all intruders at bay. Now the snow was leaving, and with it went the anonymity, the invisibility, the beautiful protective blankness that had hidden them from the world. Every footprint she left now lingered, every path she walked became a trail. Every time she passed through the fissure, she left evidence, a scuff on the rock, a thread from her coat caught on a sharp edge, a smear of mud on the stones she had so carefully arranged to conceal the entrance. She became obsessive about concealment. She swept her tracks with pine branches. She entered and exited the cavern only in darkness when the mountain's shadows swallowed all movement. She wore moccasins she had stitched from deer hides, soft-soled and nearly silent, and she learned to walk on a stone wherever possible, leaving no impression, no trace, no proof that she existed. But she could not erase the mountain itself. The meltwater running downhill from the area around the fissure carried with it tiny traces of the cavern's interior, mineral deposits, a faint coloration in the water that was different from the surrounding runoff, subtle things, invisible to most eyes, not to Kessler's. She found his signs with increasing frequency now. A broken branch at eye level snapped deliberately to mark a path. A cairn of small stones, three piled on a flat rock, the universal prospector's signal for something here. Boot prints in the soft spring mud, heavy and precise, the prints of a man who walked with purpose and economy, who never wandered, who covered ground the way a machine covers ground, systematic and relentless. He was tightening the circle. Lorena stood at the fissure entrance one evening watching the last light die on the mountain, and she understood with a cold mathematical clarity that it was no longer a question of whether Kessler would find them, it was a question of when. Inside the cavern, life continued its quiet rhythm. Colette read by the fire, her breathing shallow but steady, her mind as sharp as ever, even as her body diminished. She had taken to writing in the margins of her books tiny, precise annotations in a handwriting so small Lorena needed the lantern held close to read them. Observations about the cave, about the gold, about the waterfall's changing moods, about her daughter's transformation from a grieving girl to something she described in one margin as a woman the mountain would recognize as its own. Beckett had developed a new habit. Each morning and each evening he would walk to the fissure entrance, press his nose to the crack between the stones, and stand there for several minutes, breathing deeply, reading the air with the ancient, unfathomable sensory apparatus that made him in many ways their most sophisticated instrument of survival. Most evenings he would turn away and return to the fire satisfied, but some evenings he would linger, his hackles would rise, the low growl would start in his chest. Those were the evenings when Lorena did not sleep. It happened on a morning in late May when the mountainside was green with new growth and the air smelled of pine sap and wet earth and the wild, intoxicating fragrance of things coming back to life. Lorena was inside the cabin mending a tear in her coat. Colette was at the small table reading. Beckett lay by the door. The waterfall thundered its perpetual song, and the lantern light was soft gold and peaceful. Beckett raised his head. Not the slow, casual lift of a dog hearing a distant sound. This was instant, total, every muscle in his body engaged at once, his ears rigid, his nostrils flaring, his eyes fixed on the fissure entrance with an intensity that made the air in the cabin feel suddenly dangerously thin. The growl that came from his throat was not a warning, it was a statement. Someone was here, not outside, not approaching, here in the cavern. Lorena was on her feet before the thought fully formed. She grabbed the axe from the wall and pushed Colette behind her into the corner of the cabin furthest from the door. Colette did not protest. She did not speak. She simply moved her ancient body, folding into the shadows with a silence that spoke of a lifetime of practiced invisibility. The sound came from the main chamber beyond the cabin near the fissure entrance. Not a footstep, quieter than that. The soft, controlled sound of a man placing his boots with deliberate care, testing each step before committing his weight. The sound of a professional. Then light. A lantern's glow, pale and wavering, spilling around the edge of the stone pillar that separated the cabin from the entrance passage. It moved slowly, steadily, painting the cavern walls with shifting shadows, and behind it the silhouette of a man. He was lean and angular, all sharp edges, exactly as Lorena remembered. But he was different too. The months on the mountain had changed him. His face was thinner, darker, weathered to the texture of old wood. His clothes were worn and patched, his boots were cracked, but his eyes were the same. Those flat, gray, predator's eyes that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Kessler stood at the entrance to the main chamber, his lantern raised, and looked at the cabin that Lorena had built inside the mountain. He looked at it for a long time. His expression did not change. There was no surprise, no triumph, no excitement. There was only assessment, the slow, methodical cataloguing of a man who has found what he was looking for and is now calculating its value. Then his gaze moved to the walls, to the gold. The lantern light caught the thick, ropey veins of yellow metal woven through the white quartz, and for the first time since Lorena had seen him, something moved behind Kessler's eyes. something hot and hungry and deeply fundamentally human. The flat gray surface cracked, and beneath it she saw the thing that drives men across oceans and over mountains and into the darkest places the earth has to offer: greed. Pure, distilled, uncomplicated greed. He had not come here for Whitmore, that was clear in the first instant. A man acting on another man's behalf does not look at gold the way Kessler was looking at it now, the way a starving man looks at bread, the way a drowning man looks at a shore. He had been searching for months, enduring cold and loneliness and the brutal indifference of the mountain, and somewhere in those months the mission had changed. It was no longer about Whitmore's death or Whitmore's land. It was about this, the gold, and it was his. Mrs. Calloway. His voice was quiet, controlled. The voice of a man who is holding something volatile and knows that sudden movements could set it off. Lorena stepped out of the cabin. The axe was in her hand, held low, the blade angled forward. Beckett was at her side, his body pressed against her leg, his growl a continuous rumbling vibration that she felt through the soles of her feet. You've been busy, Kessler said. He looked at the cabin again, at the hearth, at the carefully chinked walls, at the sleeping loft visible through the doorway. Built all this yourself. You need to leave. I don't think I do. He lowered the lantern slowly, carefully, and set it on a flat rock. His right hand moved to his belt where a revolver sat in a worn leather holster. He did not draw it, he simply rested his hand there, a gesture that was both casual and absolute, a reminder of the fundamental imbalance between them. I've been on this mountain for 5 months, he said, sleeping in the cold, eating what I could quill, searching every crack and crevice in this god-forsaken rock. 5 months. He paused. Whitmore thinks you're dead, everyone does. The widow and her mother swallowed by the winter. A sad story, a cautionary tale. He took a step forward. Beckett's growl intensified. Kessler's eyes flicked to the dog, then back to Lorena. I'm going to make you an offer, Mrs. Calloway, and I'd advise you to consider it carefully, because the alternative is considerably less pleasant. There's no offer you can make. Half. He said the word like a stone dropped into water. Half the gold. You take your share, I take mine, and we both walk away. Nobody needs to know about this place, not Whitmore, not anyone. And if I refuse? Kessler's hand tightened on the revolver's grip, not drawing, just tightening. The subtlest of movements, the difference between a suggestion and a promise. Then I go back down the mountain. I tell Whitmore what's here. I tell the assayer in Ridgewater. I tell every prospector and claim jumper and fortune hunter in the territory. And they will come, Mrs. Calloway. They will come with picks and shovels and dynamite, and they will tear this mountain apart, and you and your mother will have nothing. Not the gold, not this cave, not even the grave of the man who found it first. The mention of Silas was deliberate, a blade precisely aimed. Lorena looked at Kessler. She saw a man who had spent 5 months alone on a frozen mountain, driven by a hunger so powerful it had consumed whatever humanity he might once have possessed. She saw a man who would kill her if he had to, who would kill Colette, who would kill Beckett. Not out of malice, but out of the simple amoral arithmetic of a man for whom other people are obstacles or opportunities, never equals. I need time to think, she said. Kessler studied her. His gray eyes moved across her face, reading it the way he read terrain, looking for deception, for weakness, for the small tells that reveal a person's true intentions. You have until morning, he said. I'll be outside. He picked up his lantern. He turned. He walked back toward the fissure, his boots echoing on the stone, and the light went with him, leaving Lorena and Beckett standing in the firelight's glow, the sound of the waterfall filling the silence he left behind. Lorena did not sleep that night. She sat by the fire with Colette, their voices low, their faces lit by the flickering light, and they talked. Not as mother and daughter, not as caretaker and patient, but as two women facing a threat that required the combined intelligence of both of them. He won't honor any agreement, Lorena said. Even if I give him half, he'll come back for the rest. or he'll talk. Men like him always talk. Colette was silent for a long moment. She was sitting in her chair by the fire, a blanket across her knees, her hands folded in her lap. She looked small, she looked old, she looked to anyone who did not know her like a woman who had been defeated by time and circumstance, a woman whose only remaining power was the power to endure. But her eyes were not old. Her eyes were bright and sharp and alive with the calculating intensity of a woman who had survived things that would have broken most people, a woman who had buried a child and a husband and had walked into a blizzard and had come out the other side diminished but unbroken. You know this mountain, Colette said. Every passage, every chamber, every crack in the rock, you have spent months exploring it, mapping it in your mind. He has been here for 1 hour. Lorena looked at her mother. The mountain is your weapon, Colette said. Use it. They planned through the night. Lorena drew a map of the cavern system in the dirt floor of the cabin using a stake and the light of the fire. The main chamber, the waterfall, the pool, and beyond them a network of passages she had explored during the long winter months, tunnels that branched and twisted and dead-ended in ways that were confusing even to her who knew them well. One passage in particular, a long narrow tunnel that sloped downward for perhaps 300 yards before ending abruptly at a solid wall of rock, a dead end. But the tunnel had a feature that Lorena had discovered by accident one afternoon when she had been exploring with a lantern and had squeezed through a crack in the tunnel wall that she almost missed. It led to a parallel passage barely wide enough for a person to fit through sideways that doubled back to the main chamber. A shortcut, an escape route, but only if you were small enough to fit. Lorena was small enough, Kessler was not. In the morning, Lorena met Kessler at the fissure entrance. He was standing outside, leaning against the rock face, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. He had slept in the open, wrapped in a bedroll, and the cold had put a rawness in his cheeks that made him look almost human. I'll show you the main vein, she said. The real one, not what you saw last night. That was just the surface. The mother lode is deeper. Something shifted in Kessler's eyes. The hunger, the hot consuming thing that had driven him up this mountain and kept him here through 5 months of isolation and cold. It flared, and for a moment the mask slipped, and Lorena saw the full naked force of his desire. Lead the way, he said. She led him into the cavern, past the cabin where Colette sat by the fire with Beckett at her feet, past the waterfall and its thundering curtain of water, past the pool with its glittering sediment, and into the darkness beyond. She carried a lantern. He carried his own. The two circles of light moved through the stone passages like twin moons, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The air grew cooler as they descended, damper, heavier, with the smell of deep earth and ancient water. The sound of the waterfall faded behind them, replaced by the silence of places that had never known a human voice. She talked as they walked. She pointed out veins of gold in the tunnel wall, some real, some imagined, feeding his hunger with each glittering glimpse, keeping his attention on the walls and not on the path. She talked about Silas, about his notebook, about the months of exploration that had led to this place. She talked about the geology, the quartz matrix, the hydrothermal processes that had concentrated the gold over millions of years. She talked and talked and talked, and Kessler followed his eyes on the walls, his mind on the fortune he believed was just ahead, just around the next corner, just a little deeper. They reached the dead end. Kessler stood before the solid wall of rock, his lantern raised, and his face changed. The hunger cooled, the calculation returned. He turned to Lorena, and in his grey eyes she saw the first flicker of understanding. There's nothing here, he said. No, Lorena agreed. She moved, not forward, sideways, into the crack in the wall that was barely visible in the lantern light, a black line in the dark stone that looked like a shadow but was in fact a passage. She turned sideways, pressed her body into the gap, felt the rock scrape against her chest and her back, and she squeezed through. Kessler lunged. His hand caught the edge of her coat, and for a terrible suspended moment. She was stuck half in and half out, his fingers gripping the fabric, the rock pressing against her from both sides. She heard his breathing hard and fast, and she felt the strength in his grip, the desperate, grasping force of a man who sees his fortune slipping away. She twisted. The coat tore, the fabric ripped free of his hand, and she was through, stumbling into the parallel passage on the other side, her lantern swinging wildly, the shadows leaping and dancing on the narrow walls. Kessler tried to follow. He turned sideways, pressed himself into the crack. His shoulders entered, his chest entered, and then he stopped. The rock gripped him like a vise, unyielding, immovable. He was too broad. The passage that had admitted Lorena's smaller frame would not admit his. He pushed, he strained. The rock did not care. It had been here for 100 million years, and it would be here for 100 million more. And the struggles of one man against its ancient, indifferent mass were as meaningless as a moth beating against a window. Calloway. His voice echoed down the tunnel, distorted and strange. Calloway, you can't leave me here. Lorena stood on the other side of the wall, breathing hard, her torn coat hanging from her shoulders, and she looked back through the crack at the thin sliver of Kessler's lantern light visible on the other side. Your lantern will last a few more hours, she said. Her voice was calm, calmer than she felt. After that, it will be dark, completely dark, the kind of dark that you have never experienced in your entire life. You'll die for this. His voice was raw, stripped of its professional composure. I'll find my way out. I'll bring Whitmore. I'll bring the whole territory down on your head. Maybe, Lorena said. Or maybe you'll wander in circles until the oil runs out and the dark comes, and then you'll sit in this tunnel and listen to the silence and wonder if anyone will ever find your bones. She began to walk away. The parallel passage was narrow but navigable, and she knew the way. Every turn, every junction, the route burned into her memory by months of careful exploration. Behind her, Kessler's voice echoed off the stone, distorted into something barely human by the acoustics of the tunnel. She walked for perhaps 10 minutes before the voice faded. The silence returned deep and absolute, and with it came the weight of what she had done. She had trapped a man in the dark. She had left a human being in a stone tomb with a dying lantern and no way out. And in a few hours, when that lantern guttered and died, he would be alone in a darkness so total that it would press against his open eyes like a physical thing. A darkness that would erase the difference between seeing and blindness, between waking and sleeping, between being alive and being nothing at all. She could leave him there. It would be easy. It would be safe. Kessler would never be found, and no one would ever know what happened to him. Whitmore would lose his tracker, his tool, his last connection to the mountain's secret. The problem would simply cease to exist, absorbed into the stone like water, like silence, like time. Part of her wanted to, the part that remembered Kessler's hand on his revolver, the part that heard his casual threat to bring the world down on them, the part that had spent 5 months in fear watching the circle tighten, knowing that this man was out there patient and relentless, hunting them with the cold efficiency of a predator. But there was another part, a part that sounded like Colette. Lorena emerged from the passage into the main chamber. The waterfall greeted her with its eternal thunder, and the lantern light from the cabin cast a warm golden rectangle on the cavern floor. Colette was standing in the doorway, leaning on the frame, Beckett beside her. They had been waiting. It's done, Lorena said. He's trapped in the deep tunnel, the dead-end passage. Colette studied her daughter's face. She read it the way she read her books, carefully, thoroughly, missing nothing. And I could leave him there. Yes, you could. He would die. Yes, he would. And no one would ever know. You would know. Colette's voice was quiet. And I would know. And this mountain would know. And every night you spent in this cavern for the rest of your life, you would hear him. Not with your ears, but you would hear him. Lorena stood by the fire, the axe still in her hand, her torn coat hanging from her shoulders. She looked at the walls of the cabin she had built. She looked at the waterfall. She looked at the gold gleaming in the lamplight, that silent, glittering fortune that had been the cause of so much fear and so much suffering. If I let him go, he'll come back, she said, or he'll talk, and they'll come, all of them, and everything we've built will be gone. Maybe, Colette said, or maybe not. There is more than one kind of currency in this world, Lorena. More than one thing a man will accept in exchange for silence. Gold, gold. Colette nodded. Enough gold to make him forget this mountain exists. Enough to buy a new life, a new name, a new place far from here, where the memory of a cave in Colorado is worth less than the effort of remembering. And if it's not enough, if he takes the gold and comes back anyway? Colette looked at her daughter, and in her eyes, Lorena saw something that was not doubt. It was faith, not in Kessler, not in gold, but in the daughter she had raised and the woman the mountain had made. Then you will deal with that when it comes. But if you leave him to die in the dark, Lorena, this place stops being a home. It becomes a grave, his grave. And you will live in it, and you will build in it, and you will grow old in it, and every stone will remind you of what you did to keep it. She paused. Her breathing was shallow, labored, the scarred lungs working hard. Your father was a gentleman, she said. No, Silas was a good man. They gave you everything soft and kind in you. But the hard part, the part that swings an axe and fights wolves and builds a cabin inside a mountain, that part came from me. And I am telling you, as the woman who carried a dead child for 2 days because she could not let go, that letting go is sometimes the bravest thing a person can do. Lorena went back. She took a large leather pouch and filled it with gold, not nuggets, not dust, chunks. Heavy, irregular pieces pulled from the softer veins near the pool, each one worth more than most men in Colorado would earn in a year. She filled the pouch until it was almost too heavy to carry, until the leather strained at the seams, until the weight of it was undeniable, a fortune you could feel in your arms and your back, a future made solid and heavy and real. She went back into the deep tunnel. She went back through the parallel passage, squeezing through the crack in the rock, and she emerged into the dead-end chamber where Kessler sat. His lantern was dimming. The flame had shrunk to a small, desperate bead of yellow light that barely reached the walls. He was sitting with his back against the rock, his knees drawn up, his revolver in his hand, aimed at the crack in the wall. His face was slick with sweat, despite the cold. His eyes were wide. He was afraid, for perhaps the first time in his adult life. The man who hunted other men, the man who solved problems with a tracker's patience and a killer's efficiency, was genuinely deeply afraid. Not of Lorena, not of the gun or the dark. Afraid of the mountain itself, afraid of the immense crushing indifferent weight of stone that pressed in from all sides, that would not move, that would not yield, that would be here long after his bones had turned to dust. Put the gun down, Lorena said. He stared at her. The revolver did not move. I brought you something, she said. She held up the pouch. Even in the dying lantern light, the weight of it was visible, the way the leather sagged, the way her arms strained. She loosened the drawstring and tilted it, and a cascade of gold chunks tumbled into her palm, glinting dully in the fading light. Kessler looked at the gold. He looked at Lorena. The calculation began again behind his eyes, the cold mechanical process of weighing options, measuring outcomes, assigning values. But something was different now. The calculation was contaminated. Fear had entered the equation, and fear changes everything. Take it, Lorena said. Take it and leave this mountain. Go south, go west, go anywhere. Start over. Buy a ranch, buy a saloon, buy whatever kind of life you want. But you will never come back here. And you will never speak of this place to anyone. And if I do, Lorena looked at him. She did not raise her voice. She did not threaten. She simply looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had buried her husband and carried her mother through a blizzard and fought wolves with an axe and built a home inside a mountain with her bare hands. A woman who had just left him to die in the dark and had come back not because she was weak, but because she was strong enough to choose mercy when murder would have been easier. If you come back, she said, the mountain will not be as kind as I am. Kessler weighed the gold in his hands. He waited against the darkness pressing in around him, against the memory of the stone, gripping his chest against the dying light and the rising fear, and the knowledge deep and certain that this woman was not bluffing. He took the gold. She led him out, through the tunnels, past the waterfall, through the main chamber where Colette watched from the cabin doorway with eyes that missed nothing, and out through the fissure into the morning light. The sun was just cresting the eastern ridge, pouring pale gold across the mountainside, and the air was clean and cold and full of bird song. Kessler stood outside the fissure, blinking in the light, the heavy pouch clutched to his chest. He looked back at the crack in the rock, at the hidden door to a world he would never enter again. The old man, he said, his voice was hoarse, scraped raw by hours of shouting in the dark. Holt, he's the one who told Whitmore about your husband's prospecting. Sold it for medicine money. Thought you should know. The words hit Lorena like a physical blow. Holt, old Holt, who had given them the mule, who had pressed jerky into her hand, who had looked at them with eyes that she now understood had held not just pity but guilt. The betrayal settled into her chest like a cold stone, but she did not let it reach her face. Go, she said. Kessler went. He walked down the slope, without looking back, the pouch of gold heavy on his shoulder, and Lorena watched him until he was a small, dark shape moving through the trees far below, getting smaller, getting fainter, until the mountain swallowed him and he was gone. She never saw him again. The story of what happened to Kessler after he left the mountain is not hers to tell, and so we will tell it only briefly. He rode south. He crossed the border into New Mexico territory. He bought a small ranch outside of a town whose name does not matter with money that no one asked about, in a place where men with new money and old secrets were common enough to be unremarkable. He never returned to Colorado. He never spoke of the cave, not because of his promise to Lorena, but because of what he had felt in the dark, that crushing ancient silence, the mountain's indifference, the terrible knowledge of how small a man truly is when measured against stone and time. Some experiences do not need to be guarded by promises, they are guarded by fear. And Whitmore's end was quieter and in its own way more complete. Without Kessler, he had nothing. No tracker, no hunter, no tool with which to pry the mountain open. His creditors back east, who had been circling for years, finally closed in. The debts that had driven him west in the first place caught up with him with the slow, inexorable certainty of a tide. He sold what he could. The Callaway cabin, already falling apart, went for a fraction of its value. The other properties he had accumulated through foreclosure and sharp dealing were liquidated one by one, each sale a small capitulation, each signature a minor defeat. He left Ridgewater on a Tuesday morning in late summer on a stagecoach bound for Denver with a single trunk and a leather folio full of papers that no longer represented anything of value. No one came to see him off. He was a man who had wielded the power of law and ledger like a weapon, and when the weapon was taken from him, there was nothing left. He was not destroyed by Lorena or by the mountain or by any single dramatic event. He was destroyed by the accumulated weight of his own small, mean calculations, by the slow erosion of a life built entirely on the principle that everything and everyone has a price. He was in the end a man who understood the cost of everything and the value of nothing. Inside, the mountain life went on. The seasons turned. Summer came to the world outside, warm and golden, filling the meadows below with wild flowers and the creeks with fat trout. Lorena hunted deer in the high meadows and gathered berries by the bushel, drying them in the warm air that flowed through the fissure on summer afternoons. She made trips to Broken Creek, always in disguise, always careful, trading small amounts of gold for the supplies they could not make themselves. Salt, sugar, flour, medicine for Colette, new tools, books, always books. No one asked where the gold came from. No one asked where she lived. In the mining towns of Colorado, anonymity was a currency more valuable than gold, and Lorena spent it wisely. Autumn returned, then winter, then another spring. The cycle repeated, each revolution bringing small changes that accumulated like sediment, building a life layer by layer, day by day. Colette grew weaker. It was not a decline, but a settling, a gradual easing of a body that had carried too much for too long. Her mind remained brilliant, her tongue remained sharp, and her observations scribbled in the margins of her books grew more philosophical, more contemplative, more concerned with the large questions that occupy a person when the small ones have been answered. What is wealth? She wrote in the margin of her poetry collection next to a stanza about rivers. Not the gold in the rock. The gold in the rock is just pressure and time and accident. Wealth is the absence of fear. Wealth is knowing that tomorrow will come and you will be ready for it. Wealth is a door that closes and a fire that burns and a daughter who swings an axe like she was born with one in her hand. Beckett grew old. His muscles silvered, his movements slowed, and the hitch in his stride from his wolf-eyed wound became more pronounced with each passing season. But his golden eyes still held the same watchful intelligence, that ancient, knowing gaze that seemed to see not just the present moment, but all the moments that had led to it, the blizzard, the fissure, the first breath of warm air from the mountain's heart. He was the guardian of their sanctuary, the one who had found it, the one who had led them from death to life, and he wore his age like a medal, quietly and with dignity. One evening, a year and a half after Kessler's departure, Lorena stood at the edge of the pool, watching the lantern light fracture into 1,000 diamonds on the cascading water. The cavern was quiet, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of completeness, the silence of a place where everything that needs to be is already present. The waterfall thundered, the fire crackled in the cabin behind her. Colette's voice, thin but clear, floated through the open door, reading aloud from a new book, a novel about a woman who sails across an ocean to find a new world. Beckett lay at Lorena's feet, his body warm against her ankles, his breathing slow and deep. His tail moved once, a single lazy sweep across the stone floor, and then was still. Lorena looked at her hands. They were not the hands she had started with. They were hard, calloused, scarred, the hands of a woman who had swung an axe and fought wolves and pulled gold from the earth and built a home from nothing. They were the hands of a woman who had carried her mother through a blizzard and faced down a man with a gun and chosen mercy when death would have been easier. They were good hands, strong hands, hands that had earned their rest. She thought of Silas, not with the sharp, lacerating grief of the early days, but with a warmth that was almost peaceful, a gratitude for the time they had been given and the things he had taught her even in death. The notebook, the pan, the knowledge that there was something hidden in the mountain waiting to be found. He had given her the map. The mountain had given her the destination, and she had walked the distance between them on her own 2 feet. She thought of Holt. The betrayal still sat in her chest, a cold stone that would never fully warm, but she understood it now in the way that you can understand a thing without forgiving it. He had been a man caught between impossible choices. His love for his dying wife weighed against his loyalty to a neighbor, and the scales had tipped the way they had tipped. It was not justice. It was not fair. It was simply human, messy and painful and real, and the mountain which dealt in geological time and had no use for human morality offered no judgment on the matter. She thought of Whitmore briefly, the way you think of a storm that has passed, a danger that has receded so far into the distance that it no longer has the power to frighten, only to remind. And she thought of Colette, her mother, the woman who had carried a dead child for 2 days and had never spoken of it. The woman who had walked into a blizzard and said, "I'll take the honest cold." The woman who had sat by a dying fire in a cave inside a mountain and looked at a fortune in gold and said, "You can't eat it." The woman who had taught her by example and by silence and by the sheer stubborn act of continuing to breathe that survival is not a single dramatic act but 1,000 small daily choices, each one a declaration that you are here, that you matter, that the world has not yet earned the right to erase you. Lorena turned and walked back to the cabin. She stepped through the door and sat down in the chair across from Colette. Beckett rose, slowly walked to the space between them, turned 3 times in the way of all dogs since the beginning of dogs, and lay down with a contented sigh. Colette looked up from her book. Her eyes, ancient and bright, met her daughter's. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Lorena looked at the fire, at the walls of the cabin she had built, at the waterfall shimmering through the small window, at the vast, dark, secret world that had saved them and sheltered them and demanded of them nothing more than the courage to keep living. "I'm thinking about what home means," she said. Colette smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that lives more in the eyes than on the lips, the kind that comes not from happiness exactly, but from the deep, quiet satisfaction of a woman who has seen the worst the world has to offer and has decided, despite all evidence to the contrary, that it is still worth inhabiting. "And what does it mean?" Lorena looked at her mother. She looked at the dog sleeping at their feet. She looked at the firelight dancing on the stone walls and the gold gleaming in the shadows and the water falling endlessly from the darkness above into the darkness below. "It means this," she said. "It means exactly this." The waterfall thundered on, the fire burned, the mountain held its breath around them, patient and ancient and vast, keeping its secrets, keeping its promises, keeping 2 women and an old dog safe in the silence of its stone heart. And outside, far above, the stars came out over the Sangre de Cristo range, cold and bright and indifferent, watching over a world that did not know that somewhere beneath its surface, in a cathedral of rock and water, a home had been built, a fortune had been found, and a woman who had once wept before a man with a